morning. We are in week 3 of Better News Daily, and for the first time, we have hit the New Testament epistles. So this is exciting. These are short New Testament letters that are just jam-packed with memorable, bite-sized passages. So I had a lot to choose from. We're in Galatians today, and as I was going through and rereading this letter to prepare for this, I was catching all of the really memorable passages that appear a lot in sermons and in Bible studies. But as I was reading through the book, I was reminding myself of how these individual popular passages fit into the overall train of thought within this book. So what I want to do today is I want to look at one passage that is super popular. In fact, it's probably the most popular passage in the entire book of Galatians. And then I want to lay out how this passage fits into the overall argument of Paul's letter. And I think by doing this, it will breathe new life into something that you already know and love. So let's see how this goes. The passage for today is the fruits of the Spirit. You can probably quote quite a few of these, if not all of them. This is a super memorable list, thanks to songs like "The Fruit of the Spirit" by the Coconut. That one. Let's read the passage and then we'll see how this fits into the overall letter. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. Now, what does Paul mean by this? These 2 verses are a list of virtuous qualities. So it's easy to see this as just a checklist of standards for a follower of Jesus. This is how you should act. But if you read the whole letter, that's not Paul's point. In fact, that's the opposite of his point. You'll notice this passage comes in Galatians 5. It's almost at the very end of the letter. This is one of Paul's closing thoughts. So let's see how he got here, and maybe that'll help us out a little bit. Paul wrote this letter to churches in Galatia who were in the middle of a heated cultural debate. You see, when Christianity first became a movement within Judaism, there remained the question of what to do with non-Jewish believers. Did they have to adopt specifically Jewish practices in order to become Christians? The issue that Paul is specifically addressing in Galatians is the issue of circumcision. There were some Jewish Christians that were saying that Gentile converts needed to be circumcised before they became followers of Jesus. And people in Galatia were now starting to believe that as well. Acts 15 is a great place to look that summarizes this whole debate. Well, Paul hears about this, and he's very frustrated, so he writes them a letter, and that's Galatians. Well, like many of Paul's writings, Galatians is about the relationship between the law and grace, between faith and works. And Paul's argument here, and in other things that he writes, is that no one can be justified, or another way to say that is, no one can be made right before God by the law. You can only be justified through faith in Jesus. And that faith in Jesus results in the transformation of the heart. So to clarify, Paul isn't saying that the law is a bad thing. No, the law was a good guide. The people of Israel were given the law so that they could model God's character to the nations around them. And they would then be a blessing and a witness to those nations. The problem was that the law only highlighted their sin and failure. And so the law didn't refine them, it only condemned them. Why? Because their hearts were a mess. The only way that they would be able to keep God's law fully would be through a transformation of their heart. Well, how could they do that? Enter Jesus. See, the death of Jesus was not just a legal transaction that happened where the price of sin was paid for so that you and I don't have to. That's part of it. Jesus' sacrifice also unleashed a new way of living for all who believe in him. Which leads to Paul's words in Galatians chapter 2, which I think are the thesis statement of the entire book. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Wow. Okay, so Christ now lives in those who surrender to him. Jesus activates what Paul will later call life by the Spirit, which is when we are transformed from the inside out because of our faith in what Jesus did and in who Jesus is. Well, that sounds amazing. How do I get this new life? It sounds great. Well, it starts by dying. I have been crucified with Christ. Yikes. That sounds super dark. What does that mean? Surrendering to Jesus means dying to an old way of doing life and trying to measure up, dying to old habits and patterns that were leading us to death anyways. And then through faith in Jesus, we are resurrected into a new life that is empowered by the Spirit of God. And what does that new life look like? Here's where my long rabbit trail reconnects. It looks like a person who, by the power of God's Spirit, cultivates a life with things like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. See, the point of these fruits of the Spirit is not that they become yet another standard for us to try and live up to, as if they represent the behavior requirements for a Christian. No, Paul's whole point is that you can't be these things without the power of the Spirit. But if you trust Jesus, you become by faith what Jesus is by nature. Now, does this happen overnight? No, of course not. I mean, they're called fruits of the Spirit for a reason. They take time to grow. Paul will say this right after the passage of the fruits of the Spirit: since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. That's why I love the metaphor of a walk with God. When we do life at God's pace and under His guidance, we begin to grow into the transformed people of God. And this is the gospel good news. The gospel is not about doing and earning. It's about believing and becoming. So if all of that wordy theology just turned your brain into oatmeal, sorry. Here is my boiled down question for you to chew on today. Which gospel do you trust in? Paul opens the letter to the Galatians annoyed that the people have fallen for a false gospel. And I think that the people in Paul's day fell for something that we are susceptible to as well. You see, there is a gospel that says right life leads to eternal life. Being a Christian is about behavior management so that we can make the heavenly guest list. But there's another gospel, Jesus' gospel, I would argue, that says that eternal life leads to right life. That Jesus' sacrifice has opened the door to eternal life for all who will accept it. And that gift of love transforms life in the flesh here today for all who accept it. See, the gospel is not an invitation to moralism. It's an invitation to real transformation. So as you look at this list of the fruits of the Spirit, which gospel do you trust in? The gospel that says, do these things, be loving, be joyful, be patient, etc., so that you will be saved. Or the gospel that says you are saved through faith, and this faith empowers you to become this kind of loving, joyful, peaceful person. Put simply, the fruit of the Spirit is not the requirements for being saved. They are the result of being saved. That's my thought for you today. We are going to hit the randomizer button and see where we are going to tomorrow. I've been having fun with this, so I hope you're having fun listening to these as well. Hey, a gospel! We're in Luke tomorrow. I'm going to have a relaxing day tomorrow making this one. All right, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for tuning in.